Easton scandium, because even Salsa was selling a scandium bike, but it was not like actual Easton scandium. Because eventually the molecular whatever of what was being considered scandium became more common and wasn't what like Easton advertised and really like was pushing as the scandium tube set.
So it's like any alloy, but they're calling it scandium.
Yeah, and it's very similar to why Specialized got in trouble with the whole metal matrix, because
It wasn't really
it
metal
wasn't
matrix.
really metal matrix. You know, it's just a spin on words. I mean, those scandium salsas were a massive deviation from like what was an actual Easton. Because if it didn't have that Easton stamp on it, like it wasn't an Easton scandium tube. And it was also very obvious what was an Easton scandium tube because they were all externally budded. They had like a bulge at the head tube that went tapered down, then a bulge at your seat tube. And it was a very obvious tube set. Like the whole point of scandium was to move away from what aluminum was doing, which was beer can sized tubes. And they were trying to like aesthetically please an audience with a smaller tube set. And scandium was not large diameter. It bulged at the weld area. Apparently it rode amazing. I know those Reigans, we sold a bunch of them.
Supposed to be like really.
But when you don't use the ginormous diameter,
Then it rides normally.
so you are taking, like, you're just trying to create this, all right, so we have to go back to, I'm not sure if you discussed it, like, steel is real, right? Everybody's trying to mimic.
In the beginning, there was iron.
Yeah.
We'll start with that.
Mimic the ride. I mean, I personally think titanium should be real because no bike rides better than titanium. So, but they're trying to mimic the steel ride quality, but be lighter. It's like, well, yeah, we did that with titanium, but titanium was too expensive. So aluminum, which produced a very lightweight bike, but everybody said it rode like crap. So scandium was trying to answer that problem, but it was a very difficult material to work with, and it was expensive. I think those frames were twice as much as like a lot of the aluminum frames that were coming out at the time. And
But nowhere as bizarre as Brush Wellman's frames. Those were the pinnacle of weird frame materials because they were beryllium.
and Univega had like a boron frame.
Right, but it wasn't. The Brush Wellman frames were really, honestly beryllium.
Wasn't there also a frame that was made out of magnesium?
Oh,
There were-
yeah.
there were
Yeah.
a ton of those, but beryllium is in terms of it's toxic. It's nearly impossible to make. Toxic like then it kills you type toxic, not like you get cancer in 15 years type toxic. But it is stiffer than steel. It is lower specific gravity than aluminum. Amazingly high tensile strength, and shatters like glass when you finally exceed its yield strength. And can't be welded at all. Even Brush Wellman, who's the company that I think they're the only people that make beryllium metal in North America, had to use adhesive bonded joints in their bikes.
So the like bonding was aluminum, like.
Yeah, investment cast aluminum lugs and beryllium tubes stuffed in, and each tube was like five grand. I mean, it was disgustingly expensive. They made I think they only made 2 bikes.
It's also like, at what point are you getting the advantage of the tube? Because like that investment cast aluminum lug is really the dictator of the ride quality of the bike more than just the straight section of the triangle. So you never really got to experience whether or not you were going to like it.
But it was a period in that represents that period where everybody was material crazy. I mean, there was a period before that everybody was like alignment crazy, which was one of the funnier parts of bike history. Is like, oh, we built it on this. Oh, we've got like a granite plate a foot thick. It's like a welded structure. Get over it. It's not a machine tool, it's not an optical assembly, but that was a big selling point in the 70s and the 80s, was how precisely you aligned your bikes. And nowadays, no one even cares one way or the other. You don't ask about that. But then the next thing that happened was we made them out of steel. Oh, we can make them out of aluminum. We can make them out of carbon, but that took a few tries, because try one was the people who funded the initial branding of Merlin, which was Kestrel, because that was our first name, and we trademarked it. And since the Kestrel Carbon Company was Devil Hogg, who, has his head doesn't fit in the door usually, but they confronted us at the Long Beach show and said, well, we have invested this much money in our branding, and we're going to send you a cease and desist. And Gwyn Jones, our third partner, said, well, that's nice, but we've got it registered with the U.S. Trademark Office, so bite me. How much are those advertising materials worth? That's the starting point where we negotiate for the name. So Merlin was originally called Kestrel, and it went to Merlin because that was the next bird in the Birds of New England bird book that Lenny Freed, Mike's wife, was using to come up with designs for the logo. So we already had a bird-based logo, and we could just go to the next bird of prey in the page, which is a Merlin.
And
And
here I thought it was all about magic.
nope, that was it. It was all about the bird.
I thought it was a fish.
It's a bird. We're sticking with the bird. So that's a piece of trivia there. Anyhow, go
Well,
for it.
I mean, my thought on how to get this on topic is, well, there's a number of things, in my opinion, that happened for the evolution of the mountain bike, and I feel like Gary probably stopped off in we'll say like the late '90s or mid '90s kind of thing, and what started to happen in the early 2000s was obviously wheel sizes were added to the equation. So we had 26-inch wheel from in the beginning. Obviously, like GT was one of the brands that was smart enough to experiment with like the original 2.9er. Bruce Gordon was obviously experimenting with the original 2.9er. I do believe that there was one other brand.
Well, Gary Fisher.
Oh, Bianchi. Bianchi had like an actual like 2.9er, but they were all just kind of like, whatever, you're really weird.
It wasn't until Fisher invented it. Then it was real.
But Fisher did. Wes Williams finally like said, I'm gonna try this again, and walked around Interbike with this giant wheelets bicycle, and it caught on, right? So like people were like, hey, this is kind of cool. This wheel size is neat. And I have a theory, which is completely unproven, was that mountain bikes were on the verge of death, right? Like it was just not doing well. The sales were not good. The stagnance of the bicycles was in existence. And this is the reason why single-speed mountain bikes became a thing, because shifting sucked, the mountain bikes kind of sucked, and people weren't really into riding them, and they needed to come up with some reason for people to still want to ride a mountain bike. And hence the rigid one-speed. You introduce complexity by way of how hard it was to actually ride it, but simplicity in the actual thing you were riding. It didn't break, it didn't require much maintenance, but it was fun because all these trails that you could ride with your eyes closed out of memory became fun again, because you were like, oh my God, that was so hard, but in a good way. And yeah, so like the one-speed mountain bike, that was like 97, 98, 99. It was all about a one-speed mountain bike. It completely saved Bianchi. They were the only brand that made a one-speed rigid bicycle. They're like, holy crap, this is like the easiest bike we could make, and it's selling like hotcakes. Like, this is great. And they sold the crap out of that bike. And then you have Surly, who saw an opening. They're like, oh, we can sell this frame that just says 1x1 on it, and all the mechanics and bike shops can take their crap parts and put a bike together. But then all of a sudden, every one of them had a Chris King headset and a $400 wheel set, and like they're like, that wasn't the point of this. The point of this bicycle was that you just put crap parts on it. But no. And so that became really popular. But the 2.9er was just like a whole nother breed of things, because now the brands were like, well, should we do this? Should we not do this? And Gary Fisher, I think it was funny because Gary Fisher made a step forward as well as made a step back all at the same time. Because in '97, introduced Genesis geometry, which I rarely will give Fisher credit for actually inventing something, but that idea was seriously for real, because all the stock bikes were coming with 60 millimeter stems, all added to the front center of the bike. Changed this, put slack head angles, got Fox and RockShox to make a 51 millimeter rake fork, and these bikes were revolutionary. Like, they really were. This was a geometry change that was completely outside of the norm. And I personally thought they were really cool. Like, I actually probably still have the invoice where I like begged Moots to make me a bike with a 1-inch longer top tube, like all these changes to their geometry, and they were like, wow, why would you ever do this? This is so stupid. And I was like, all right, fine. And I got independent to do it, and they thought it was stupid, but I really liked it. I thought that the longer top tube, short stem, slack head angle made sense. But then they came out with the 2.9er, the Pro Caliper was their first 2.9er, and they went back to stocking it with a 110 millimeter stem, 72 degree head angle, and you're like, well, wait, like, you have these 26-inch mountain bikes that have this like cool geometry, but you're introducing this big wheel mountain bike where you deviated from this like revolutionary thing that you came up with. And for 4 years they were selling these Ronald McDonald bikes, I called them, because like the first generation Fisher 2.9ers had this hideous paint job where it was like blue, red, and yellow. They were horrible, but it was the only color. That was it. Like, you bought the Pro Caliper 2.9er, and not until Jameis, Marin, because Specialized Giant and Trek, ironically, even though Fisher was owned by Trek, we're not doing these 29-inch wheeled bikes, right? Like, it was the niche brands that were doing the 29-inch wheeled bikes. But it wasn't until Genesis 2 where the big wheel and the geometry changes finally like merged together. And I thought that those bikes were pretty cool. And parallel happenings to this whole thing was every brand trying to make a full suspension bike that wasn't a total piece of junk, which, in my opinion, they never did until like 5 years ago, because the full suspension bikes were
That was a long evolution.
a long period of time. I mean, like, if you can find me a person that bought a full suspension bike in the year 2000 and didn't hate it by the year 2002, you know, and then bought a full suspension bike again in 2005 and didn't hate it by the time it was 2007, like, these were 2-year bikes that sucked from the moment you bought them, but you were convincing yourself that it didn't because, like, oh, I bought this $4,000 bike, it's got to be amazing. No, it's not. It has pedal kickback. It needs a ton of maintenance. The geometry is garbage. The bottom bracket's too high. All these things, like, so many flaws in the design. But the evolution was working with the 29-inch wheel. But the funny thing was, again, like, head angles were too steep because they're like, oh, it has a bigger wheel, so you got to be more like a road bike and this and that. And there was this period, like, what, like 2010 to like 2015, almost 2018, where very little change was happening to geometry. The bikes were like the same. They felt like they settled in, right? Like 13.5-inch high bottom bracket. Chain stays were like how short can we get them before the shifting just completely implodes, which is 435 millimeters, like right around there. And no matter what your top tube length was, it had to be relevant to speccing 100 millimeter stem, 110 millimeter stem. And head angles shall never go slacker than 70 degrees, unless it was a downhill bike, 68 degrees, right? But in Spain, this is, in my opinion, in Spain, they were like, you guys are all morons, and I'm going to make this bike with like a 66 degree head angle. I'm going to lower the bottom bracket to the point where if you don't know how to ride a bike, you're going to smash your pedals on every obstacle known to mankind. But even better, how about I just put some shorter crank arms on it and keep the bottom bracket low, extend my front center to the point where I'm going to run the shortest stem humanly possible, which means your handlebars are touching your steer tube. And yeah, this is going to be a great bike. And everyone was just like, oh my God, these people are crazy. What are they thinking? And they were out there bikes, right? Like,
And which Spanish companies were these?
no, these were
Yeah,
like
no.
small
Okay,
garage
just-
companies. Like, it didn't even, they were steel 35-pound full suspension bikes that were being made in like 2015, 2016. But if you were to like grab those bikes and just like plunk it down here right now, you would be like, oh wow, these guys were super ahead of the curve. And it took a long time for the big brands to finally like, and Specialized was the absolute last one to give in, right? Like their bikes were too short, their bottom brackets were too high, everybody didn't like their bikes, and the Stumpy, right? Like the 2018 Stumpy was the first one to extend the front center, go slack below 68 degrees, and it was like pretty revolutionary to see a brand like that maybe not admit publicly that they were completely wrong, but that was a massive, massive change from what their bikes were 1 year prior, right? And of course, they revolutionized all these ideas. Like, look what we came up with. And it's just, yeah, like you came up with what everybody else has been doing for 4 years. But it evolved to the point where, you know, you look at a mountain bike that has been produced in the last 3 years, and there is no similarity to a mountain bike from 10 years ago. And the interesting thing that I thought that took place during this whole period, like from 2005 to 2022, is all the brands finally gave up on following the norm, right? Every bike from like 1979 to that year had the same bottom bracket thread, had the same spacing on the rear wheel, had the same, well, unless you ran U-brakes, the same mounts for your brake. They all ran the same head tube size until they didn't, and they went from 1 inch to 1.1 inch. But like, very few brands were willing to just say, hell with it. I'm gonna try all this different stuff. And then it became, the floodgates got opened, right? Like, oh, everybody has a different disc brake mount. Everybody has a different bottom bracket standard. It's not standard. Everybody has a different bottom bracket idea. Everybody has their version of what they're going to do for a head tube to be tapered. Everybody has a different this. Everybody has different that. And it's still not really settled, right? Like the 1.5 to 1.1 tapered fork, we'll call that settled. I think that that's around to stay. I think the rear end is still not settled because you have people running boost, super boost, and if they're running super boost, are they running a 73 millimeter bottom bracket or an 83 bottom bracket? So seat tube diameters even, right? For how long did a bike just have a 27.2 seat post? And then, oh, well, let's introduce this bigger size, 31.6. Okay, that makes sense. That's so that you can run a bigger seat tube and you have a bigger seat post. Well, 30.9, it's like also kind of cool. Fits in the same seat tube diameter, but it's thicker, so it's a little better. Then Specialized is like, bigger's better. So we're going to make a 34.9 seat post that has a 38.6 seat tube. These types of things, like, as the evolution happened, I feel like some of the brands were doing it because they were actually trying to make the bike better. And then other brands were just doing it because they're like, we got to do something different. Got to come up with something different. And that, unfortunately, wasn't making the bikes better. And it wasn't helping the situation, right? If everyone just went from 27.2 to 30.9, that would have been awesome, right? You have two seat post sizes. One is more traditional, one is a little bit more modern. But we have 31.6, 30.9, 34.9, still have 27.2. Luckily, 26.8 went away. And from a bottom bracket standpoint, you had 68 and 73, 68, 73, 68, 73. Now we have 68, 73, 83, 86, 92, 100, 110, 386 Evo. The list goes on and on and on and on. And again, not really helping the evolution. Question?
The point of why? Like the bottom bracket is, I mean, why can't they stay with like the road bottom bracket with like 68?
Well, so the difference from 68 to 73 made sense because it was a chain line scenario, right? You had a 130 rear end, which has a chain line of 42.5 millimeters, and you had a 68 millimeter shell, which gave you adequate space to create a crank that had a 42.5 millimeter chain line. So then you go from 130 to 135, which made sense because you needed a stronger width on your hub shell and everything to make a mountain bike. So now you have this 2.5 millimeters. So you went 2.5 millimeters wider on each side of the bottom bracket shell. So that made sense. 68 to 73 made sense. It was a scenario where you just cut it down the middle and went like this, right? You cut the bottom bracket down the middle and you widened it the same amount that you cut the hub down the middle and you widened it. So,
Well, here's a point that you started out with is an interesting one, which is from 78 to some recent time period, nothing changed.
yep.
And it was because we talked about this yesterday. The bike industry sometimes gets beer goggles about tradition. And what we were doing was we're making road bikes that were it's like forcing a dog to walk on its hind legs. It doesn't like it, but you can make it happen. Is we're putting tires on those bikes that they had no business having tires that big. We were putting forces on the front end of the bike that no 1-inch steerer was ever designed to handle, but we never let go of it. And this is my opinion, is that Crane Creek is the one that like put the first chink in the dam by saying 1-inch steerers are just dumb for things like mountain bikes. And then of course, pretty rapidly, McCready at Santana was like, yeah, how about 1.25 inches too, because they're dumb for tandems. But think of how many years a tandem, which has humongous front end forces going on, had 1-inch steers, and you practically had to put solid steel rods in there to keep the forks from failing, when just by changing the standard. But people were really afraid to change the standard. Is one of those where you ask yourself years later, it's like, no, it was just tradition. It's like nobody was going outside of the box. I'd really credit Crane Creek for the first ones to like mainstream the idea of let's do it differently. Not only go bigger, but who died and said quill stems are the only way to attach your handlebars, because that suddenly then you're not forced to have a certain wall thickness. You can make heavy wall steers because you don't have to have that inside diameter going. But once that happened, then it went nuts.
Yeah.
Then it was like free for all. Who needs 135 quick release 10 millimeter rears? Like, let's go through axle. Let's have 20 millimeter bolt on fronts maybe for downhill,
In the beginning, yeah.
or 12s, or
15.
so you can please continue the rant about
Well,
standards.
but I think that that's an excellent, like, the tandem. So Santana, think about this, like, 145, which is what Santana wanted the rear ends to be, made so much more sense than 135, right? So they went from 130 to 135 because they were like, well, how far can we push this? Like, we just need the rear wheel to be stronger. Okay, just, bump it up 5 millimeters. But the reality was 5 millimeters wasn't enough, right? 145 would have been great because we wouldn't even have done 135 and 142, and then like, if we just went right to 145, then 148 would have just been the through axle version of 145, right? We wouldn't have had to have had a version of bikes, which was what, like 2010 to 2015, that were through axle but were 142 before they went to 148, which made like all of those wheels useless. And
Or the hybrid ones that were even worse than all of them.
well, 150, which was Shimano's downhill scenario, which was a through axle without the shoulders, right? So like your wheel, you had to have 5 hands to like hold it in place and get your axle to go through it. And the 20 millimeter was the same scenario. The 20 millimeter didn't have the shoulders, and so you had to fight to get your front wheel in. And yeah, I mean, I don't have a problem with that because you're not going to always get it right the first time, right? They knew that the through axle was a good idea. And the funny thing was, the reason it was marketed was that it was stiffer, which is the case on the front because you have telescoping fork legs that you're trying to keep from rotating. But it had zero effect on the stiffness of a rear end of a bicycle, and it had everything to do with your disc brake. Right? Like, you can't move a wheel with a brake if it's encapsulated. It's always going to go back in the same place. Your rotor is always going back in the same place. Your caliper is always going to be aligned. And yet they sold it as this thing like, oh, the full suspension bikes, they're rickety and you have to have a through axle. It's the only way it's going to work. It's like, well, I kind of agree with you on a full suspension bike, but you made it seem like it doesn't need to happen on a hardtail and it doesn't need to happen on any bike that has disc brakes. But it did. It needed to be on every bike with disc brakes.
So your wheel doesn't get yanked out of the fork.
No, it can't move. Right? Like, think about that. Like, think about the lawyer that came up with the lawyer tabs, and you want to be like, yo, buddy, you failed at your job. Because what you should have done is you should have looked at that fork and said, we need to have this thing be a full circle so that even if this dingus doesn't even know how to use a quick release, their wheel can't fall out. Because that's so much better. It's so much safer in every way, right? So like the lawyer tab was a Band-Aid for a real problem, but they didn't actually fix the problem in a good way.
Ross had that weird dropout thing where it had a top section and a bottom section, and if it fell out, it would fall into the bottom.
Almost like a speed release,
Yeah.
right? Like, and then Schwinn had a pretty good solution with those little snap-on tabs, right? Like, they were annoying, but dang it if they weren't going to work. If your wheel's not going to fall out of the bike.
The problem with the Ross, though, is that people would put it in the bottom where it was weak, and then they would just set it hard mounted into the
Right.
bottom.
And once somebody has actually used a through axle, they're like, oh, okay, this isn't actually that bad. It's pretty genius, right? It's a great system.
It's not on road bikes.
But if the road bike has disc brake,
You can change the damn wheel in Tour de France now. It's insane. You know?
None of us are Tour de France riders, so
Yeah.
that's
Get off
Yeah.
my lawn.
Yeah.
yeah, I
right.
mean, but okay. How many races in the what was the winning time in the Tour de France, and what was the time of the guy that came in second? Was he 5 seconds off?
You got me on that one.
Right. I bet you it was about an hour. Could have been 15 minutes. I guarantee you that every mechanic that's in that car could have changed those wheels with a through axle in time for everybody to stay in the same position in that finish time.
Well,
So
and-
like their argument, now the only one that would have been a difference was the guy who won the sprint.
Yeah.
Okay, so that guy needs a fast wheel change. Well, maybe we should figure out how to make the bikes not get flat tires as easily.
Brilliant.
Brilliant. Now we don't give a shit how long it takes you to change a wheel. You know, so like put some time and effort into the other problem and like not have these wheels that can literally jingle loose and fall out of a bicycle and kill people.
And on top of that, acknowledge that racing is its own thing.
Its own thing.
And that look at all the amazing cutting edge technology in an F1 car, and 90% of it you'd be hating life if it was on the car that you drove every day.
Yeah.
It would be terrible. It'd be the worst car ever. So just because it works on an F1 car doesn't mean that Honda should be putting it in the next Civic that they put out.
Yeah.
And that's where the bike industry really messes up, is they conflate racing, which should be purpose-built machinery. It isn't every other sport that involves machinery. And then there's the stuff that they sell to the consumers in huge quantities. And the bike industry has never been able to let go of that weird concept that the bike that you ride every day should be the same bike that you can be a world-class cyclist and enter one of the great tours. And there's no place in regular cycling. So
And the disc brake proved.
Yeah, the disc brake really
it
proved
that ultimately people will finally concede that they would rather have something that's what they want and not what is in the Tour de France, right? Like, how many years was the disc brake not on a road bike, yet people all would have loved it, but they didn't do it because they're like, no, I want my rim brakes, until finally everybody was like, you know what's way better than a 25 millimeter tire? A 30 millimeter tire.
right.
It's way better.
And you know,
and guess what? The best way to put a 30 millimeter tire on your bike is to get rid of that caliper brake, because it's a super pain in the ass. When you make it big enough to fit a 30 millimeter tire, it doesn't work anymore. And so,
well, and the other thing is, like, you know what else is, like, you should be able to ride your road bike like on a gravel road.
yeah,
But of course,
I would just call it a road.
Right, but the genius there is we're going to make you buy a whole different type of bike,
Yeah.
because you couldn't ride.
We're going to give it a new name. I just called them road bikes.
But that's
I always call them
just
road
like
bikes.
marketing genius. But
Yeah.
the thing is that the disc brakes also then let you take your road bike off road, and if you knock the wheel out of true, it doesn't matter. You got a disc brake. As long as the tire isn't scraping the stays, you're making it home.
Yeah,
It's
I'm
fine.
all like, again, like, to go back to like brands changing and adding and coming up with all these like schemes and ideas that make life too hard on us. I'm okay with everybody trying to do something if their intention is to make the product better, right? Like if your intention is to make the product better, I'm all for it. Perfect example is the crank. Like, I'm not going to hate on Cannondale for coming up with BB30, because BB30 ultimately changed the game of the cranks. Because the square taper doesn't work. It's garbage. The spindles are stupid. It's too easy to hog it out, over tighten it, crack it, whatever. But it just kept going and going and going. It was like an Energizer bunny, the square taper. It just kept going. And then finally, Cannondale was like, I'm done. I'm going to come up with something different. And
Coming up with all kinds of different.
and they did. And BB30 sucked because of the orientation of the bearings and the frame and the tolerances that are required and the C-clips and everything. But that 30 millimeter spindle changed the game. And now there's a ton of really good cranks. I make one. But anyway, you know,
Who makes them?
yeah, there's a ton of really good cranks now, and it all pays homage to the fact that Cannondale was a brand that just said, we're going to do this, right? Like, they had the Sweet Wings, which, not their idea, but I think, you know, like, they kind of got in on that. And they had the Coda cranks, which were all Magic Motorcycle stuff, which were really, really very good. And it all opened up the window to, so I'm okay with, like, the bottom bracket standard changing, and it needed to change because we needed the bigger bearings and we needed the bigger spindle. But then it just got crazy because all they needed to do was make it bigger. Didn't need to have 7 different widths. Didn't need to have one that's like offset one way. Didn't need to have this and any of that. But we needed to evolve off of the square taper. And kind of the same thing when it comes to the rear wheel spacing. You know, we're going to give Trek credit for coming up with Boost because it's better. And when they did come up with Boost, which was on their first 3-inch tired 2.9er. That was why they did it, because you couldn't have gears and a 3-inch tire and a 142 rear end and not have the chain hit the tire. So they were like, okay, we still want to sell this 3-inch tire. So we're just going to open up the rear end, move the cassette out, and keep the crank where it is, and now our chain doesn't hit the tire. So, like, that needed to happen. And everybody agreed. So Boost Spacing finally is like the owner of the situation. So we'll give Trek credit for seeing a problem, fixing the problem, and having the willingness to be like, we're going to put these bikes out that have a wheel that's wider than everything that everybody else has, which at first people hated, but now everybody has it. I mean, I'm all for the slack head tube angle. I think that there's a tipping point, just like everything. I think 64 is the end game. I think if you go below 64, then you've passed the point of return. It's too slack.
For what kind of bike?
For a full-on mountain bike,
Yeah.
an enduro bike. You know, a downhill bike, I think they actually do go to 62, but you have to understand that a downhill bike is only ridden at this angle. So not everything is part of the equation when all you're doing is riding a bike at this angle.
How much fork brake are you pairing with at 64 degree angle?
I mean,
So you're gonna get miles of wheel flop.
no, you won't. Have you ridden one?
I used to ride,
No, this is a yes or no question.
Yeah,
a 64, no.
okay.
I'm telling you, it defies all of what your mind is going to convince yourself of. The whole, like, when people would ask me, like, what's the trail number on, I have no fucking idea. I don't care, because all I know is that when you ride a bicycle that has an over 800 millimeter front center, it has a 65 degree head angle with a 51 millimeter rake fork, you can come up to an 18-inch log, and all you need to do is lean back, and you're going to go right up and over that log. None of this like, oh, pull my whole body up and like swing this thing over. You don't have to. You just relax yourself, you let that wheel touch the front of the log, and you're going to go up and over it. You go downhill with baby head-sized rocks that are all loose, boulder here, boulder there, and you just let it rip. And I guarantee you that bicycle is going to go like the wind down that hill.
I think it would be terrible on pavement, but that's not the
But
point.
it's a mountain bike.
It's not
And then someone's going to say,
designed to do
yeah,
that.
but it's going to climb like shit. And you're like, no, because if you put a 75 degree seat angle on the bicycle, you have all your weight right where you need it to, and you will climb up that hill, and you will not have your front end lifting up because you have the correct center of gravity based on this steep seat angle. And then you're going to say, yeah, but your seat's in your way when you go downhill. No, it's not, because you drop it and you plunk it out of the way, and you can go all the way up to like a 76 degree seat angle, and it doesn't matter because you're going to drop it when you go downhill.
So at this point, I think there's an interesting thing to consider is look at what has gone on in mountain bikes in
Yes.
the last 10 years. Look at what's gone on in road bikes in the last 10 years. It's a big yawn. I mean, it's a kind of an interesting juxtaposition there is in terms of the equipment and the components, it's kind of the same old thing.
Right,
Unless-
they just keep adding a gear.
Right, or you take some good idea that came up maybe, like disc brakes.
Yeah, all the good stuff
it
that's
isn't
happened to a road
necessarily-
bike is
and-
borrowed from the mountain
And I'm
bike.
saying this more as an observation, is it's interesting how many companies build road bikes, mountain bikes, cross bikes, they have a whole line, but their road bike line is equally slow to adopt innovation and change. All these things that Drew has been talking about, they've all come out of mountain bike design and the building of mountain bikes. And it's like, what has come out of road bikes in the last 10 years?
That
What-
wasn't adopted from the mountain
Yeah,
bike.
what new and innovative thing has come out of road bikes? I can't think of anything at all.
Mike?
Yeah, I was gonna,
What's shifting?
electronic.
Electronic shifting?
It doesn't work.
It does. It does.
It does.
So the funny thing about electronic shifting is the greatest thing about electronic shifting is the front derailleur. greatest because it overshifts and then it feels the wattage and it backs off and it's like, ha, that it doesn't drop your chain. It takes it from 20 cadence all the way down from like a 32 up to a 48 and it shifts it. But the whole rest of the industry, because they can't keep up with Shimano when it comes to front shifting, is trying to make everything be a one by.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's funny because SRAM has a pretty powerful presence in the situation, and they're going to keep trying to tell you that the one by is better because they can't make a front derailleur that's worth a damn. So, you know, it's...
Well, I just don't like the way they're making you stay with one grupo and one grupo only. There's no customization because, you know, the chains are not even, you know, you can't even use them across brands. I don't know.
It's good
maybe
marketing.
5 years ago or something, they just.
Do I feel like that? But do I feel like that is a bicycle centric thing? Like, let's go into any other industry and say that you want to be able. I mean, I don't know. Okay, cameras. Let's go to cameras. You bought a Canon camera, and you had Nikon lenses, and you're pissed off that your Nikon lenses don't fit on your Canon camera.
But they do have adapters for those type of things.
Yeah, they have adapters.
You're ruining my example.
No, but it is an example on purpose. They're not interchangeable with each other.
Right? Like it isn't Shimano's job to make sure that their parts work with SRAM, and it's not Campagnolo's job to make sure that they make parts that work with Shimano.
And for any manufacturer that wants to have an entire system, it's up to them to engineer the individual components to work as best they possibly can with their components. And the heck with whoever else.
Yeah, I don't fault people for making something that doesn't play friendly with somebody else's part, unless that's your job. Like, I'm making cranks. My job is to make cranks that try and play friendly as much as possible with all the other components, because that's what I'm trying to do.
You can't even,
That doesn't make any, why don't they?
Why don't they standardize
one is
it?
wires and one is wireless now, so now you kind of gotta make the frame, you know, or cables. You have three choices now that you gotta kind of dedicate.
Well, you can run the wires on any external system. Like, you know, it doesn't aesthetically please you, but no one's stopping you from putting Di2 on a bicycle because it doesn't have holes in it.
Yeah, but some people are gonna say, I'm gonna run SRAM wireless and, you know, give me nothing, and then they're gonna regret it later, maybe, you know, when they wanna switch, you know, or, you know what I mean?
I get your rant, but I'm trying to understand where's the problem involved. You just don't have to buy it.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Yeah. You don't.
And we are talking about the evolution of the mountain bike.
Yeah, we
Not
I knew
not
that
the
this
marketing
would I knew that
strategies
this
of
would move off
Shimano.
of the topic.
Yeah.
But okay, so
All those options
to
are-
attempt to put it back on topic,
You know, you can't evolve your ride into the future. You're stuck.
now forward compatibility should never be on their mind. They're in business to make money
Why not?
because they want to sell you the next group.
Yeah.
And that's another bunch of junk.
That's fine.
That's why we have single speed.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, all right, so to attempt to put it back on topic when it comes to like the evolution of the mountain bike, I think that right now, I mean, I have been my entire life, adult life. I started in this industry when I was 23 years old. I'm 50 years old. Every single day of the last 27 years has been nothing but bicycles. So I have seen, in my opinion, the entire evolution of the mountain bike. Because any mountain bike before 1995 is a fucking hybrid. It's not a mountain bike. Okay? So everything after 1995, I'm sorry. They started to become mountain bikes. Like you could actually ride the bike off-road and not feel like you're going to die. And suspension has to be part of the equation. Large tires, air volume has to be part of the tubeless tires have to be part of the equation. Certain things just like had to happen, and they made mountain bikes better. But right now, I honestly believe that they are at a pinnacle. Like there are certain things that I don't think that they're going to improve upon. I just don't see how they could make a mountain bike better than it is right now. And what brands are trying to do to make them better is like turn the down tube into a storage compartment. What? Like, how does that make my bike better? Like, I don't care about taking burritos on my freaking bike ride. That is not making my bike better. And let's add a motor. Nope, that's not making my bike better. I don't want a battery on my bike, and I don't want a motor on my
But
bike.
you can put the burrito in the battery box.
Yeah.
You know, they should make it so you can make a choice.
You know, you're
there.
starting to see the de-evolution of the mountain, because it's like they ran out of ideas, they hit their peak. The bikes are awesome right now. So, well, I agree that the long front center, right? Like, I think that the sweet spot is that like 40 millimeter stem, the 770, 750 millimeter wide handlebar. They obviously tried 800 millimeters and they're starting to back off of that because it was too wide. And they tried to go like all the way to a direct mount stem that was like almost 0 millimeter stems. That wasn't really working either. So, you know, like this 32, 40 millimeter stem is kind of like the sweet spot. 770, the sweet spot of the handlebar width. 75 degrees is the sweet spot on the C-tube angle. 12 and a half inches is the sweet spot on the bottom bracket height. You know, they definitely have come up with the only thing that changes relevant to the style of bike is the head angle, right? So you have 64 degrees is sort of the enduro, 65 degrees is maybe like the trail bike, 66 degrees is like the cross-country bike.
Well, and the user interface will keep evolving because it has to fit a human being. Right. So, I mean, you're going to see a variety. And this is one thing that's great. It's like road bike, drop bars, drop bars, drop bars, drop bars, drop bars, drop bars. It's like, get a life, you guys, because you look at mountain bikes, you've got what's become traditional now are the very wide bars, but there's just as many people who like just doing gravel, and you're doing skinny ones that maybe have a little bit pullback, or some of those neat carbon ones that give you a bunch of different places that you can hang on to. But that's like fine-tuning the interface between the rider and the bike. It's same thing with pedals, is flats are thankfully
making a
back
big
again.
comeback.
They're making a big comeback because people have,
Well, my
never
theory,
mind, I won't do my rant
so
on that
my
one,
theory
but-
on the flat pedal and why, like I have seen some people ride with flat pedals that just blows my mind. Spectacular riding, and I'm like, I don't even know how you just did that. Until you rode the bike, and you realize like this bike is not actually trying to buck you off of the bike. Half of the reason people needed to be clipped in is because they're riding a bike with a 72-degree head angle, and they're going down a hill, and it's ready to just traject you off of the thing. And now all of a sudden you're riding a bike to where you can relax and you can rip downhill, and you're like, holy crap, that you can be on a flat pedal. You can also get over a log without needing to like yank up on the entire thing to get the damn thing over the log. So you can use a flat pedal, and you're also wearing a shoe that is like waffle flat bottom that's gripping into these spikes, and yeah,
right.
yeah.
But that's getting back into the whole user interface thing.
Bear trap pedal coming back and smack.
It's not though. Like if you go grab a bear trap pedal, it doesn't grip like these modern pedals. They also have a stack height of like a frickin' 2 inches, which you know you're like all the way up over the spindle. And now you look at a flat pedal and it has like a stack height of like 10 millimeters.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, is you don't have that, so as
Right.
a result, flat pedals are coming.
But I
Right,
guess,
yeah.
but
The original
point-
bear claw was just like.
But the point I was trying to make is all these choices exist in mountain bikes
Yeah,
now.
yeah.
That you can, people sell you a bike with, it's just weird how hidebound the road stuff is and how awesome the choices are that we now have with mountain bikes, and everything from a set of narrow gravel bars with pullback to the, I don't know, motocross Red Bull Rampage
Right.
width bars.
But okay, so
and
you use
everything
the
in
bear
between.
claw, you use the bear claw, you use Joe Breeze's height right, and you use all these ideas that people were coming up with, but they were bailing on them, right? They weren't like refining them. They came up with their original idea and it like did okay, but it didn't do awesome, and then they just walked. Oh, okay.
But they were good ideas
They were
fundamentally.
good ideas fundamentally in the beginning, and what happened was there was like this large gap between them, and finally, maybe with the aid of a computer, maybe with the aid of like better manufacturing, whatever, we're back at a lot of those ideas, but they're doing them way better.
That's one thing that I'm kind of interested in is, you know, that point of stagnation and evolution that you guys were talking about earlier, where everything was kind of the same going through 27.2 seat posts, all of that kind of a thing, before it started to bubble up. But, like, how much of that was kind of driven by the fact that Shimano, particularly in mountain biking, didn't have any kind of competition, so nobody could go and demand anything until Trek got big enough that that kind of power shifted where a
Can I
brand
answer
was
this
able
one?
to come up and
Please,
say,
please do. Are
"We
you going to
want
mention
this kind of
CNC machines?
I'm good. So
Yeah.
I have a theory
Yeah.
that is a direct answer to what you just mentioned, because I will answer, the first part of your answer is the Shimano M800 was the pinnacle, like an absolutely mind-changing group of components. That was the V-brake, that was their one-piece outer chainring with like, you know, that whole group was freaking amazing. And the only reason that group exists is because Shimano was getting their butts kicked by companies like Grafton and Ringley and White Industries and all these niche brands, and they were living the dream of just like, nobody's even taking any money from us. No one's, oh crap, people are starting to take money from us. And so they actually had to sit down and engineer an entire group, and when they did, it was amazing. And that was a huge change. You take a mountain bike from 1993 and it had cantilevers and it had index shifting, but maybe it was thumb shifting, and it had like a rear derailleur with a spring that was like total garbage. And then like all 1 year later, that's all that took them, 1 year. You bought a mountain bike in 1993 and you bought it with XTR that had cantilevers and all. Man, I feel bad for you, because 1 year later, that bike was a million times better.
And the other big change was, it had nothing to do with the bike industry. It had the cost of CNC equipment started to drop radically, and you saw manufacturing capacity that only a huge, heavily capitalized company could have. Is how many CNC machines do you own?
4.
4. Okay, one person shop, 4 CNC. You're unusual, but I had a CNC machine when I was, and that didn't exist back in the day. That was not something your average frame builder could buy. But now it's no longer the person approaching the bench in a religious manner with the files and the leathery thingy, and you put your goggles on and you squint at the sooty window to see if you've got good alignment. It's like you can buy a secondhand Haas for not much money, and you can start designing your own bike part. The other thing is the software got really good. The design software got really good and really inexpensive.
So why, I don't know, why might not be the right.
That's the second question. But
But from that time of like Ringo, you know, all those small kind of component manufacturers, it seems that they just kind of dropped off the face of the earth. And-
Except for Doug, he's upstairs.
Yeah.
He flew his plane here.
Yeah, he and then Paul and Phil, you know, seem to be the only kind of,
I don't put Phil Wood in that category.
no.
No. They make a good spoke roller. We'll leave it at that.
Okay, but still, I mean, we've got two where at one point we had a bunch of smaller manufacturers. And with the,
How many Kuka cranks broke?
oh, I
Most of them. How many top line cranks broke?
there's.
All of them.
Most of them. How many Grafton brakes do you want to actually have on your bike? None of them. So like the reason these brands are not here is because they made crappy parts.
I'm not arguing for any of those to be the continuation of, but the drop in the cost of, say, CNC machines, we're not really seeing anybody kind of come in as an independent manufacturer to kind of challenge those things. Are you doing components?
Yeah,
Hot shit.
I make a crank. I'm the only person at the shop. I take the aluminum, I put it in the bandsaw, I put it on the belt sander, I load it in the CNC machine, I put it in the tumbler, I drive it to the anodizer, and I put it in the box and I ship it to you.
Is it on the bikes upstairs?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like, I am literally the only person that touched that material.
SRAM limits you to only a few choices, which is, opportunity for the aftermarket. I'm glad that there is an aftermarket. I wouldn't buy a SRAM, if there wasn't an aftermarket, because their choices are 13 is all you get.
But I think part of, to finish up, the statement about being frustrated with Shimano and SRAM is, as Drew pointed out, there was a turning point where now they're getting pecked to death by ducks. They've got tons of people. Many of them don't succeed. It's the same thing. Most people who start a small business don't succeed. That's just the way it is. But in the past, Shimano and SRAM and Campagnolo were protected because nobody could even afford to buy the equipment to try to compete with them. Now, you can afford to buy the equipment to make components that could compete with them on quality and on design. The only thing you can't compete with them on is on price, but they can't just sit on their butts anymore about design, because each year there's new people that are coming up with innovative ideas that they can manufacture themselves, and that wasn't the case 10 years ago, and certainly not 20 years ago. You couldn't do it. I remember at Merlin, it was like amazing that we finally got a CNC machine to make bottom brackets. That was, and we had to scrap, and the thing was hideous. I mean, that thing was green screen machine, not even a Fanuc 3 on that.
Well, before they cut it short, are there any
Yeah.
just
questions?
like design, Cannondale has, their mountain bike with one,
The lefty?
Lefty,
yeah. What do you
It
guys-
doesn't make the bike better.
but it works.
It works.
It works.
But it doesn't make the bike better. Like, they definitely did not make the lefty with, like, the primary goal to make, can we make the best fork that we can make? And somebody came back to them, and the best fork that they could make had one fork leg. It definitely wasn't how it went down. The conversation more than likely was, how can we make something that from across the room, somebody will instantly know that that's our product? Okay, it has one fork leg.
And if it doesn't break, they can sell it.
Yeah, and it was a brilliant marketing idea.
It did its job, but its original job was not to be the best of what it's doing.
Physics would tell you.
What about the suspension within the head tube? That was.
The head shock was another one. Like, why don't they bring that back for the gravel bikes? It's freaking genius.
Yeah.
Well, wasn't that like off of Molten?
No, Action Tech.
Yeah.
Action Tech is who first did it.
Well, Molten did have.
Yeah. But I mean,
Side
the
of it.
Action Tech was definitely what Cannondale ripped off. That was a good fork. It was a great idea. And as we were saying, like, Mert Lawwill, like, clearly, leaps and bounds better than Bradbury and anybody else that was coming up with ideas. But Mert just finally said to himself, in my opinion, these people are idiots. I'm done. I'm not going to keep trying to innovate for this bicycle industry because they don't get it. Because that leader fork was better. It only needed minimal refinements. The bushings were a problem. The bushings got sloppy fast.
The
Right.
second generation ones fix that.
Yeah. The Rissy shock that he was sourcing, it didn't have much technology in it, right? It was just a slightly damped thing that went up and down. So no matter how good his linkage design was, it was at the mercy of the Rissy shock that he was putting on it. Same thing with Amp, right? That fork was awesome, but it only lasted like 3 rides, and then it needed to be rebuilt. So if they hadn't given up, like brands like that, if Mert hadn't given up and if Amp hadn't given up, they were on the right path. Like, they had great ideas, but RockShox and Manitou were just bigger, behemoth brands that could outmarket them and make things cheaper, and they prevailed.
And keep improving, fixing what was wrong with it. I mean, they had the will to keep
Yeah.
fixing what was wrong with their products.
Mag-
From a manufacturing simplicity point, the telescopic legs are way simpler and way easier to make.
Mhm.
And that's what took over because of that. And then the internals got so much better. Instead of having a
Spring and an elastomer.
thing in there, they actually got real damping. Really turned into a form.
So, any other questions?
You said that the era ended around 2015 of like the kind of just sitting on their laurels. And what we've moved into now has been more of an era of like what I would consider like modern geometry.
I agree.
Is it all driven because of the seat post?
Oh, the dropper post played a huge role in their ability to create geometry that worked in both up and down.
Because essentially you made a motorcycle that you could then prop yourself up on and still pedal it up the hill.
Right, because you need the seat at the right height, and that steep head angle gives you better forces with the slack head angle and the longer front center, and now you can pedal up the hill, but you couldn't ride down the hill with that seat in that position. But you can drop it now, and now you can rip down the hill like the wind, and when you hit the flat, it undoubtedly the dropper post played a huge role. Wide rims with big tires and air volume also played a huge role, because I honestly think that the hardtail, the only reason the hardtail has survived like the test of time as these mountain bikes progressed and got like super, super, super technically advanced is because of the tubeless tire and the large air volume tire. If we still had a 1.95 tire on a bicycle, no one would be riding a hardtail.
That was a big tire. That was your big fat tire.
Nobody would be riding a hardtail.
Came out with 2.0.
Yeah, the ground control 2.0. Yeah, that for sure. The dropper post, in my opinion, yes, played a huge, huge role in where the geometry ended up.
Because they
Down with it up, all the way up, because it's just the way it was bars.
Oh yeah, you would just go. It'd be like riding a bike with a 72-degree head angle.
Yeah, imagine that.
they always sat at 73 on the seat tube, and it actually gave them the ability to push it forward a little bit, kind of move the front center up, move you up, move yourself more over kind of in that front area, and now you're riding in the bike rather than kind of on the bike.
Yeah.
Which I think was the entire, what we're seeing now is bikes where you can ride them as hard as you ride a motorcycle. And that's what you were talking about earlier. You lift the front and you go over it, and that's all that it is.
Yeah,
That's all
yeah.
it
Like no one's expecting you to lift a 300-pound frickin' motorized bike and get over a huge rock. It's all done by the geometry, the suspension, and they literally have bikes like catching up to this idea where if you're willing and you're daring enough to I'm gonna plow into this log and I'm gonna go over it. I mean, it takes a mindset for sure, but the bike's gonna do it.
Oh yeah, I've got like a 22 trick session, and it's got a 62.6-degree head tube angle, and you can take your hands off and ride it straight down the road.
Right.
It doesn't fly.
And then all right, so I do want to bring up one thing I only have one pet peeve, right?
No, you've got thousands.
Yeah. This is a pet peeve that people talk about bicycles and they love to say okay, he has a 62.5-degree head angle, and then people will be like, yeah, but when you hit a rock, it's 70. No. I'm going to myth bust this whole idea because if suspension is actually correct, the head angle of that bicycle never ever changes. Because this is not what's happening to your bicycle. This is what's happening to your bicycle, right? If your suspension is tuned correctly, your head angle is 62.5 degrees the whole time you're hitting objects. It's your wheel that's coming up and going down, up and this is not what the wheel is not here, and the bike is not diving down and then coming back up and diving down and coming back up. It's the wheel. And if it is diving down and coming back up, your suspension is not tuned right. So, yeah, when you read some of these things where people are like, oh, what is it when it's compressed? It's it's the same. The wheel came up to my head. My bike didn't go down. Ran over it.
That was a good one.
Yeah, it bugs me when I see
That was decent.
and you know, a lot of times people don't tune their suspension correctly, and most people that ride a modern mountain bike and say that they weren't blown away, I guarantee you the suspension is not tuned. Like, we have a seriously complex suspension on bicycles right now. You need to understand that they all play a role. Damping, like compression damping, rebound damping, high-speed damping, low-speed damping, air pressure for spring rate, oil viscosity, everything is playing a role.
We didn't have 5 years ago.
Didn't, not at all. You know, you have brands like Push and all these other brands that are absolutely pushing the boundaries, no pun intended, of like where it's going.
Probably less than 5 years.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, I feel like everything from 2018, 19 on has like, we could take a current shock and jump in a time machine and go back to the frickin' Y bike,
Yeah.
and it would be a rideable bicycle.
I put 80cc Kawasaki forks on my bicycle.
God damn it.
Wanted dampening.
Damping.
Yeah.
Ditch the EN on that word. Dampening is when you douse your bike in water. Damping is suspension.
Damp it, Janet.
Yeah. Any other questions? Mike.
Well,
You don't even ride a mountain bike.
I used to. I
He rode one on television.
No, but I just want to ask you, because I don't really know whether, well, the case with hubs and pre-built wheels have made the larger manufacturers give up on making hubs.
Compliments
You know, and
synergy for that. It goes way
I don't
back.
know what the case is these days for mountain bikes, whether, you know, that's the case for mountain bike components too, whether Shimano has given up.
Nah, Shimano doesn't really have much game in the wheel market. I mean, the only thing that matters in the wheel market at this point is that you have a quality hookless, tubeless tire that has a minimum of like a 32 millimeter inner width. You know, it's like,
Is it all pre-built wheels?
no, I mean, I still build wheels, but
Yeah,
there are definitely,
I still do that too. You know,
you have brands that, like, you know, i9 and other brands of that nature that have real, I mean, there's a whole nother thing, right? Like points of engagement on your hubs and like how it has played a role in how suspension bikes and just mountain bikes in general function. It's a thing, right? Like if you're climbing up a hill and you're in a gear that is like a 3250 and it's a 17-degree pitch and you have to, for some godforsaken reason, kick back your pedals to like clear a rock as you're pedaling up. If that thing, bear in mind, a 50-tooth chainring, right? If you have like 24 points of engagement, that pedal literally goes like to here and then back to here before you engage that thing again because of how big your rear cog is.
Yeah.
So you need like,
That brings up unsprung weight, you know.
you just need high points of engagement.
Yeah, but isn't that going backwards, putting more unsprung weight back there with that huge thing and a heavier derailleur? You know,
That's all
instead of
matter.
putting
It's kind of
Yeah.
it's a rounding error.
Yeah, it's
really.
it's pretty light.
Yeah.
you don't think that's
All you care about is that when you go and pedal forward,
putting more
It
weight
goes
on
forward.
sprung-
And that it
sprung
sounds like a
part?
fishing reel.
you need to ride an Onyx hub. Go
Yeah.
ride an Onyx hub and then you'll be like, I get it.
And the Onyx Hub, you don't feel like you've got to shout "fish on" every time you coast. Although that's profile that really gives you the deep sea rod experience.
Any other questions?
Sean, you didn't ask questions.